If you think you know Courage the Cowardly Dog, think again. There's one episode that was never meant to be seen. One that left viewers haunted long after the screen went black. Some say it was a glitch. Others call it a curse. But everyone who watched it agrees. The real horror didn't end with the show. It began the moment the static hit. The Legend of the Lost Courage. The Cowardly Dog episode has been whispered about for years, but it's always the same details that come up. A late-night broadcast, a sudden cut to static, and a scream that seemed to echo long after the TV was turned off. I never believed it, until I started digging for myself. It started with a forum post from 2003, buried deep in an old message board. The user claimed they'd been up late, watching reruns on Cartoon Network, when a Courage episode came on that they didn't recognize. The animation was rougher, the colors more washed out, and the music was just a low, droning hum. The episode didn't have a title card, just a shot of the farmhouse at night, the wind howling louder than usual. Courage was alone in the living room, staring at the TV. Muriel and Eustace were nowhere to be seen. The TV flickered with static, and every so often Courage would flinch, as if he heard something the audience couldn't. The camera lingered on his face for too long, his eyes wide and glassy, his mouth trembling. The only sound was the wind and the hum from the TV. Then the screen cut to black for a moment. When the picture returned, Courage was outside, standing in the middle of the yard. The sky was a sickly green, and the moon was missing. The farmhouse windows glowed with a faint, unnatural light. Courage looked back at the house, then at the woods beyond the fence. He started to walk, his paws dragging in the dirt, the grass crunching underfoot. As he moved, the shadows in the trees seemed to shift and follow him. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, distant scream. Courage stopped, his ears twitching, and looked over his shoulder. The scream grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was coming from inside the house. Courage turned and ran back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He burst through the front door, only to find the living room empty. The TV was still on, but now it showed nothing but static. Courage crept closer, his reflection flickering in the glass. The scream returned, louder than before, and this time it was unmistakably Muriel's voice calling for help. Courage reached out to touch the screen, and the static seemed to ripple under his paw. Suddenly the TV went dark. The room was silent, except for Courage's rapid breathing. He turned around, and for a split second, he saw Muriel standing in the hallway, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The lights flickered, and she vanished, leaving Courage alone in the darkness. Courage whimpered, backing away from the empty hallway. The house felt wrong, bigger, colder, as if the walls were breathing. He called out for Muriel, his voice trembling, but the only answer was the wind rattling the windows. The static on the TV returned, louder now, filling the room with a harsh, grating noise. Courage covered his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside his own head. He stumbled into the kitchen, hoping to find Eustace, but the room was empty. The clock on the wall spun wildly, the hands moving too fast to read. The refrigerator door hung open, the light inside flickering. Courage peeked inside and saw nothing but darkness, an endless, yawning void. He slammed the door shut, his heart pounding. Suddenly the lights went out. The only illumination came from the TV in the living room, still flickering with static. Courage crept back, drawn by the glow. As he approached, the static began to form shapes, faces, twisted and screaming, their mouths open in silent agony. Courage stared in horror as the faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide and pleading. One face stood out from the rest, Muriel's. She reached out, her hand pressing against the inside of the screen. "Courage, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the static. Courage reached out, his paw trembling. But as soon as he touched the screen, the image shattered like glass, and the room was plunged into darkness. A new sound filled the air, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep within the house. Courage turned, his eyes wide with fear, and saw a shadow moving at the end of the hallway. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. The shadow crept closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Courage tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The shadow reached out, its fingers stretching toward him, and the scream returned, louder than ever, echoing through the house, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. Courage squeezed his eyes shut, covering his ears, but the scream only grew louder, filling his mind with white-hot terror. When he opened his eyes, he was back outside, standing in the yard. The house was dark, the windows shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. The wind had stopped, and the world was silent. Courage looked down and saw muddy paw prints leading away from the house, disappearing into the woods. He followed them, his body moving on its own, the scream still ringing in his ears. As he entered the woods, the trees closed in around him, their branches reaching out like claws. The darkness was absolute, and the only sound was Courage's own heartbeat, pounding in his chest. Courage wandered deeper into the woods, the path twisting and turning until he lost all sense of direction. The air was thick and heavy, every breath tasting of earth and rot. The further he walked, the more the trees seemed to close in, their trunks warped and faces appearing in the bark. Faces that looked like Muriel, Eustace, and even himself, all frozen in silent screams. He tried to call out again, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The only answer was the echo of his own fear. Suddenly, a flicker of light appeared ahead, a faint, bluish glow, pulsing in the distance. Courage crept toward it, his paws sinking into the soft, mossy ground. As he got closer, he saw an old, broken TV sitting in the middle of a clearing, its screen flickering with static. The TV was surrounded by dozens of other screens, all different sizes and shapes, stacked haphazardly on top of each other. Each one showed a different scene. Muriel wandering the empty house, Eustace banging on a locked door, Courage himself running through the woods. The images looped endlessly, the characters' movements jerky and unnatural, their faces twisted in fear. Courage stepped into the clearing, and the TVs all turned to face him, their screens glowing brighter. The static grew louder, and the scream returned, layered and distorted, as if 100 voices were crying out at once. Courage covered his ears, but the sound pressed in from all sides, vibrating through his bones. One of the screens flickered, and Muriel's face appeared. She looked straight at Courage, her eyes wide and desperate. "You have to wake up, Courage," she whispered. "It's not real. None of this is real." The other screens began to show the same message, the words scrolling across the glass. "Wake up, wake up, wake up." Courage squeezed his eyes shut. willing himself to wake up, to escape the nightmare. But when he opened them, he was still in the clearing. The TVs still screaming, the woods still closing in. The ground beneath his feet began to shake, and the trees bent toward him, their branches reaching out to grab him. He tried to run, but the mud sucked at his paws, holding him in place. The TVs began to topple, crashing to the ground and shattering, the static pouring out like smoke. The scream grew louder, filling the clearing with a blinding white light. Courage felt himself being pulled upward, weightless and terrified, as the world dissolved into static. Suddenly, everything went silent. Courage floated in a void, surrounded by darkness. The only sound was his own heartbeat, slow and steady. He looked down and saw the omnipresent shadow, the thing that had haunted the house, the woods, and his dreams, floating below him. Its eyes closed, its mouth open in a silent scream. Courage drifted in the void, unable to move, unable to look away from the shadow below. The silence pressed in on him, heavier than the scream had ever been. He tried to call out, but no sound came from his mouth. The shadow's eyes snapped open, locking onto his, and for a moment, Courage felt every memory, every fear, every nightmare he'd ever had rush through him like a cold wind. Images flashed before his eyes. Muriel baking in the kitchen, Eustace grumbling in his chair, the farmhouse bathed in golden sunlight. Then just as quickly, the scenes twisted, Muriel's face melting into static, Eustace's eyes turning black, the house collapsing into a pit of darkness. The shadow reached up, its arms stretching impossibly far, and Courage felt himself being pulled downward, back toward the world he thought he'd left behind. He landed with a jolt in the living room. The TV was off, the house was quiet, and the first rays of dawn were peeking through the curtains. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Courage looked around, his heart pounding, and saw Muriel standing in the doorway, her face kind and gentle. She smiled at him, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Courage felt a flicker of hope. But as he ran to her, the room began to blur and distort. Muriel's smile faded, her eyes growing wide with fear. "Courage, you have to wake up," she whispered, her voice echoing and doubling, as if coming from far away. The walls of the house began to melt, the furniture dissolving into static. Courage tried to hold on to Muriel, but his paws passed right through her, and she vanished like smoke. The scream returned, softer now, but more insistent. It seemed to come from inside Courage's own head, a voice he couldn't escape. He stumbled through the house, each room more distorted than the last. The kitchen was filled with broken clocks, all spinning out of control. The hallway stretched on forever, lined with mirrors that showed Courage's reflection, each one more twisted and terrified than the last. He ran outside, desperate for escape, but the yard was gone. In its place was an endless field of static, stretching as far as he could see. The sky was a swirling mass of gray and white, and the only landmark was the old TV from the woods, sitting in the center of the field, its screen dark. Courage approached the TV, his paws trembling. As he reached out to touch it, the screen flickered to life, showing his own face, wide-eyed, mouth open in a silent scream. The image zoomed in, closer and closer, until all Courage could see was his own terrified eye, reflecting the static and the shadow behind him. The static grew louder, filling Courage's mind until he thought he might go mad. He tried to look away, but the image on the TV held him captive. In the reflection of his own eye, He saw the shadow creeping closer, its form shifting and flickering. Never quite the same shape twice. It whispered his name, the sound stretching and distorting, echoing through the empty field. Suddenly the TV screen shattered, and Courage was plunged into darkness once more. He floated, weightless, surrounded by fragments of broken glass and flickering images, Muriel's hand reaching for him, Eustace's hat tumbling through the void, the farmhouse door swinging open and closed. Each shard showed a different memory, a different fear, a different scream. Courage tried to piece the images together, to find his way back to something real, but the shards slipped through his paws, dissolving into static. The shadow's voice grew louder, overlapping with the screams from the TV, the wind in the woods, and Muriel's desperate pleas. "Wake up, Courage, wake up." He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the sound of Muriel's voice. He remembered her kindness, her laughter, the way she always made him feel safe. He clung to those memories, pushing back against the static and the shadow. The darkness began to recede, the fragments of glass swirling around him, forming a tunnel of light. Courage tumbled through the tunnel, the static fading, the screams growing distant. He landed hard on the living room floor, gasping for breath. The TV was off, the house was quiet, and sunlight streamed through the windows. Muriel was there, kneeling beside him, her face full of concern. "Oh, Courage, you poor thing," she said, stroking his head. "It was just a bad dream." Courage looked around, his heart still racing. Everything seemed normal. The kitchen smelled of breakfast. Eustace was snoring in his chair, and the wind outside was gentle. But something felt different. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed a little darker, the static on the TV a little louder when he turned it on. And every so often when Courage looked in the mirror, he thought he saw a flicker of movement behind his own reflection. A shadow, waiting and watching. He tried to shake off the feeling, to tell himself it was over. But at night, when the house was quiet and the wind howled outside, Courage would sometimes hear the faint echo of a scream drifting through the darkness. And he knew, deep down, that some nightmares never really end. Courage tried to settle back into his old routines, but the world never felt quite the same. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the TV, every gust of wind against the farmhouse made his fur stand on end. He watched over Muriel more closely than ever, never letting her out of his sight for long. Eustace grumbled about Courage being even more of a scaredy dog than usual, but Muriel just smiled and gave Courage an extra treat, as if she understood. Sometimes Courage would find himself staring at the TV late at night, unable to sleep. The static would flicker for a moment, and he'd see a flash of the shadow's eyes, or hear a whisper that sounded almost like his own name. He'd quickly turn the TV off, but the image would linger in his mind, refusing to fade. Other times, he'd catch his reflection in a window or a puddle and see, just for a split second, the shadow standing behind him, silent and patient. He tried to talk to Muriel about it, but she would only pat his head and tell him everything was all right. Courage wanted to believe her, but the feeling of being watched never left him. He started sleeping at the foot of her bed, ears perked for any sound, ready to protect her from whatever might come out of the darkness. The townsfolk of nowhere noticed the change too. They whispered about strange noises in the night, about lights flickering in empty houses, about dreams that left them waking in a cold sweat. Some said the wind carried voices, others claimed to see shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. But no one ever spoke of it for long, as if saying the words out loud might make the nightmares real. One night, as a storm raged outside, Courage sat by the window, watching the lightning flash across the fields. For a moment, the world was lit up in stark, unnatural colors, and in the distance he saw the outline of the woods where the nightmare had begun. The trees seemed to sway in time with the wind, their branches reaching out like fingers. Courage shivered, pulling his ears down tight. He knew the shadow was still out there, somewhere between the static and the silence, waiting for another chance to slip through. He didn't know if it would ever return, or if the scream would ever truly fade. But he also knew that as long as Muriel needed him, he would face whatever darkness came their way, even if he was afraid, because that's what Courage did. He was scared, but he never stopped fighting, and sometimes that was enough to keep the nightmares at bay.